So, good morning from my side, and thank you for choosing our panel. I told you in the opening session that we will have 3 Austrian panels, and the story behind the panel is that we see this series of panels with the topics which will be brought forward to the European presidency of Austria in the next 6 months. Yeah. And so the results of these panels in combination with the expertise of IFIP will maybe make it possible to formulate position papers and then provide these papers to the decision makers in Europe. I welcome our panelists, maybe next and the last one, okay? Amina Kharania from India, you know her from this excellent keynote speech this morning. And this is Professor Klaus Miesenberger from Johannes Kepler University. They all will introduce themselves later. He's an expert on adaptive technologies. Paul Nleya from Botswana. Hopefully you will meet him next year again. And Don Passey, you know, who's our editor-in-chief of the book from the conference. And I think he maybe help us to distribute the results of this panel. As ICT is a key technology of the future, equal accessibility is a key issue for our society. I'm not an expert in this, so I finish my work with this panel. I'm just a moderator. And what we do is each of the panelists is giving an introductory statement, and then we have maybe 3/4 of an hour for discussion. But I will say what I would like to ask you at the end of the session. Yeah, I will give you one of my expensive business cards, and I ask you to send me a sentence or an abstract of your ideas, what ideas, what content, what is necessary, what is important to promote adaptive technologies and the integration of disabled people. And we don't think of equal access or digital equity is not only for disabled people. There are many reasons how access to this technology can be improved for some people. So thank you. Who want to start? Klaus?
Whoever. First, thank you very much for inviting me and having me here. As said, my name is Klaus Miesenberger. I'm professor for computer science at the University of Linz here. And since, shocking, almost 30 years, I'm specializing in accessibility and assistive technologies for people with disabilities. Loud enough? Closer?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. And as said by Anton, this, of course, so to say, has a lot to do with adaptive technology. And we all know, and I don't share news with you, to say that one of the key potentials and the key resources and success factors for information and communication technology is the adaptiveness. Technology, digital information, first of all, is media independent. Only at the moment when you access digital content, the media qualities are implemented. And first of all, we always think about the screen, visual access. But the power of this technology is that digital information can be presented in different ways for perception, like audio presentation, which step by step everybody uses. Imagine a situation, you sit in a car and you want to have access to your emails. You should not look at your mobile phone and read them because it might be dangerous. Why not going through your mails using text-to-speech technology? And this is assistive technology developed for people with disabilities, solutions. People who are blind, people who have reading problems, dyslexia and others, they use this technology to access it. And there are also other ways, like perceptive methodologies. Blind people use braille displays for reading the information. And this is a basic layer of all the technologies which are out there. The digital technology. They can be presented in different ways. And the second aspect is the multimodality, how we interact with it. Digital technology does not care if we use the keyboard, if we use the mouse, or if we use speech commands, or if we use gestures, or whatever, to interact with it. This is a basic, again, a basic layer of the technology that it allows us using different ways of interacting with it. And we can easily imagine a person not able to use the hands or not having hands, that he is able to use different approaches, be it gestures, towards brain-computer interfaces today. So there is a broad range and almost endless number of assistive technologies which are already available, which can be used by different groups of people with disabilities to work with digital technologies. Earlier technologies, there was always a reason, a new technological invention, when you were not able to use it, it tended towards exclusion. When we consider the book, the printing, the Gutenberg press, it's enormously important for our society, for the development of society, but we must not forget the media quality of printing tends towards exclusion because there are considerable problems for different groups of people with disabilities to use it. If you are not able to see, if you are not able to handle a book, then this tends towards exclusion. And when we see when printing technology got accepted in society, this was also the moment when special schools for different group of people with printing disabilities were established. So they establish a social consequence out of the technology. But digital technology is considerably different because at the basic layer, as said, it is open and can support inclusion. Why is it not happening? We have technologies, as I said, assistive technologies, which are personalized, adaptive. We have globally accepted standards, how to design information, how to design technology interfaces that they can be used by these assistive technologies, that they can be used generally by different groups of people with disabilities, but they are mostly ignored, not recognized, even if there are also legal enforcements. In our country, in Austria, we have a legislation that software and web content accessibility guidelines should be used in all public areas. And I think this includes also education. But we don't have books which would be accessible. We don't have media. We don't have web learning environments which would be accessible. And this leads, or this makes, out of this basic potential of technology, which is open to everybody, makes it exclusive and tends also today to separate different groups in our society from the usage of this technology. And this, so to say, is the mission, the intention, the reinforcement over the last years, once again, and also the question to the presidency of Austria to bring this on the agenda and say that we should fulfill what politicians, what administration themselves have written in their legislation, to implement accessibility of digital technology in all areas of our society as a basic layer for participation of people with disabilities, as agreed in the UN Convention about the rights of people with disabilities, which in all its paragraphs refers to assistive technology and accessibility. Thank you. I think I'm close to 10 minutes.
Okay, I hope that's okay with the microphone. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Don Passey. I'm a Professor of Technology Enhanced Learning at Lancaster in the UK. I work in a department of educational research. I'm going to give a bit of background about me and where my work lies in terms of looking at inclusion. I'll talk a bit about exclusion and then think about maybe how we might define inclusion arising out of that. And then think about identifying technologies and considering inclusive practices. And I would also agree, I think you'll see from what I'm going to say, I would also agree that we have a large potential here which isn't necessarily being put into practice. And I'll try and think about, I think, some of the issues that there might be around that as to why that might not be happening, and try to think about what it is that we might do in order to ensure that it happens rather than it not happening. My interest is in learning, so really I'm interested in how technologies are used to support learning. I'm interested in why people find it difficult or they have challenges in terms of learning. And so one of the things that I've looked at are issues of exclusion with regard to learning. So I'm going to focus on that particularly with regard to the reasons why people are excluded from learning, and to think about what that means. And I've started to look at this, I suppose, around about 10 years ago, particularly looking at reasons for exclusion, because I was aware at that time that thinking about exclusion itself from learning was not itself just a simple thing to be thinking about. It wasn't something that would be solved very, very easily by a single approach or a single method. And I'll come back to what I think that means in terms of policy and implementation. So I reviewed the reasons for learning exclusion around about 2010, and then did a literature review on technologies that support inclusive practices, which was really based around that idea of how do you consider inclusion if you've identified reasons for exclusion. I've also looked at this in terms of drawing and gathering evidence from a range of people that came into a special issue. And I've also reviewed inclusive practice with regard to online learning, which I think is a particularly important one, because online learning, in a sense, is a lot of what we might be talking about in terms of giving general access. So the idea of gaining more general or media form access is linked, I think, to concepts of online learning. I should also say that I have colleagues in my department who also work in this field, and I'm very pleased to say that Sue, one of my colleagues, is here today with me, and Sue can add more detail, I'm sure, to what I'm saying, because Sue's worked in particular areas on inclusion. But we also have someone in our department who looks at and works with the online learning environment, and she advises and is responsible for the creation of material in the online environment which is inclusive in its practice. And I'd like to sort of emphasize that sometimes this might mean that there is a need to look at specialist involvement in terms of supporting this, and I think that there are therefore implications from a practice and policy point of view. There are many individuals who are actually excluded from learning, and it's not actually a single or a simple thing to be thinking about, and I would suggest that there are actually a large number of groups, and that was one of the first things that I wanted to look at. And I would group them basically into 5 areas, if you like, that exclusion can occur because of physical impairments or factors. It can occur because of cognitive challenges. It can occur because of social exclusion, or emotional or behavioural or geographic or locality. And they're all very different. Each of those areas is in itself quite different in terms of the ways in which that exclusion is happening and the reasons for that exclusion. And even within those broader areas, there are individual groups. So if one's starting to look at the physical group, there are motor challenges, there are visual impairments, there are hearing disabilities. So we can break it down, and if we start to look at this in detail, which I think is what we need to do, and again I'll come back to think about that in terms of policy, actually it's quite a large number of different groups that we need to think about here. If you count it up, this was my broad grouping from doing an analysis, and I'm sure it's not necessarily exhaustive, but if you count that up, that comes to something like 40 different groups. So this is not a single or a simple thing to be looking at. So a question, if we're going to talk about the online environment and online access, one of the questions that we have to ask ourselves is, which of these do we need to know about and why? Do we need to know about all of these and why? What is it that we need to know about with regard to that online access, which is going to be important to those people who are being excluded? And as a result of that, and I think actually, I mean, I've shared this with other people, with other groups before coming to this session, not within this conference, but prior. And the picture that I get is that this is something, we do need to know something about all of these groups in order to ensure access and inclusiveness with regard to online environments. So if that's the case, how do we identify the technologies that are going to support that? Because what is clear is they're all different. Because of the fact that the reasons for this exclusion are different and separate, there are different features of the technologies which we have to take into account for each of those groups. So if we're going to consider inclusion as being something which is going to address issues of exclusion, then we need to look at it in detail, and we need to think about it in terms of the specific technological features which will address each of those features. Right? Now that is in itself quite complex. It's quite detailed. It's not impossible, but it is detailed. It means that we need to look at things in detail. And one of the things that I would say here is that policy doesn't always tend to be detailed. Policy can be very generic. And my guess is that policy actually doesn't consider those 40 groups. Or it makes the assumption that the 40 groups are included and will be addressed. So one of the things that I think that one has to look at with regard to policy is how detailed does it need to be in order to address the problem that it purports to address. Because if it isn't detailed enough, then the problem is that it becomes relatively superficial. It's too generalized. And my argument here is that we need detailed pictures. And actually there are researchers that have looked at this whole area, and as we've already heard, are quite dubious about the fact that this is not happening. And Cheryl Bergstahler in the States is one of these. She's looked at this with regard to online environments across universities in the States. And one would think that universities in the States would be at a stage where they would be looking at addressing inclusion for students. And yet these are her findings. Uncaptioned videos not accessible. Content presented only with graphic images. Unorganized content. And web pages that require the use of a mouse that are not accessible in other ways. So she's starting to indicate the need to think about this in quite considerable detail. But on the other hand, there are examples of inclusive practices that are going on. So it's not that we don't have those examples, but we're not we're not, I suggest, using those examples widely to inform that wider practice. We're not bringing in examples from elsewhere that we can. And I think that sort of in conclusion, what I would say is that if inclusive practice is going to be thought about, it's also not only the environment itself, it's the environment that the individuals are within that also needs to be thought about, because that itself will create inclusion. So if we're going to really be concerned with addressing inclusion, we have to think of it from quite a wide social perspective. Even if we want to address it from the point of view of education and learning, we have to think about how that fits into wider social support and community involvement. And I think that basically we should be looking at this from a detailed perspective and not an oversimplified or generalist perspective, would be my view on that. Okay.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful to have been offered an opportunity to also share my views. And coincidentally, I have already presented a paper which really sums up a provision of assistive and adaptive technologies in the developing world, and using Botswana as the context. Well, I think the scenario has already been mapped up. Regarding inclusion and exclusion, really it's a broad topic, and if I were to give an example, in Botswana, education is from primary up to tertiary is much subsidized. In other words, it's almost free, but it's not compulsory because of the context of the country. We have got nomadic people. If you make a legal imperative that education is compulsory, then you create a problem for yourself. So it's a broader, it's a very broad context, and should be treated on that score. I mean, who would have liked education to be compulsory, but because of the context within the country, then, well, it's still not compulsory. Regarding policy in Botswana, like has already been said, strategic policy, when we got independent in 1966, we were a British colony, we started our own, mapping up our own policy on education. The first policy was not very articulate on disadvantaged groups and inclusion. But the second policy in 1994, it was very specific that a provision should cut across the board. Everyone should really be provided with education, including students with special educational needs. However, it was realized recently that while strategic policy was very articulate and very clear, but the operational policies at school, classroom, regional level was not. So other newer policies recently have now tried to trace the previous policies now to real pin themselves down to exactly how they would want to approach this issue of inclusion, especially provision for those with disabilities. What prompted my paper? My department is a department of educational technology within the University of Botswana, responsible for training teachers to provide skills for integration of technology and infusion. I remember what really prompted this is one day I was in class, and after class, one student came to me and said, "I don't do print." I couldn't understand that because, I mean, I was teaching, you know, in the class, and this student just came to me and said, I don't do print. Then I let the other students go. Then I talked to this student. Then she said she could not read anything. You know, I had been teaching for 3 hours, but she could not read that. She could, yeah, she can just know where she's walking to, but she really uses Braille. We have a Department of Special Education, so we had to make arrangements now that we integrate that aspect into the curriculum, and it was not an easy task. 4 of us were trained in the US, in the UK, and we were considering ourselves professionals in educational technology, but none of us really could do assistive and adaptive technologies. So we had now to think of how we could really cater for that kind of thing. That was not very far. So basically what we are doing now, it's to see how we could now bridge that gap, not only within our department as professionals who are supposed to be prepared to teach across the board, but also in the schools. So then we set up a project where we are going to do baseline data on provision of assistive and adaptive technologies right from primary, secondary, up to tertiary. So, but a special focus was on primary. So part of my paper really was to look at what we already have. So what we did a checklist of what assistive technologies, basic assistive technology. So we mapped those. Adaptive technologies, we mapped those across the board, whether for visual impaired, hearing impaired, and intellectual disability. So we came up with from the literature review, a checklist, and that was the checklist that we sent to the schools so that teachers could respond to the issue of provision. What is provided, what is not provided, so as to see exactly. And there was also, it was you know, multi-method approach, so that we also had open-ended questions where teachers really came up with very interesting findings, sessions, and we came up with quite a lot of themes, and we are in the process now of. So my paper really was just a part of the entire baseline study. And what we found at the moment is that, you see, there is very little provision, and teachers who are trained to teach learners with disabilities are compelled to teach in just a normal classroom, like without any technology, and from what they are saying, a lot of themes are coming out, and we hope that from this study at least we'll make an initial, a humble beginning into provision. For example, they say you can only be provided with those technologies only if a doctor, a medical doctor, or a psychologist say that. But yet, on the other hand, teachers themselves know a lot about these technologies, which could be used in schools, but their view is not taken into consideration at the regional and school level. So far, we have got about 5 regions that have responded to the questionnaire, 17 schools, and on that basis, we analyze that, and a lot of information is already coming out, but we are going to come up with a comprehensive report to assist the ministry, to assist the university also, to come up with a basic knowledge on the status regarding provision of assistive and adaptive technologies. I think with that, I also used in my paper a theoretical framework on the capability approach, whereby really the idea is that schools should really consider provision of provision for special needs as a kind of a moral imperative, really. It's something that schools should provide. But this theory talks of capabilities as well as functionalities, so that if these functionalities and capabilities could be provided to learners, they could function, and that would really provide quality of life which would not have been had that not been provided for. So basically, from my own side, I think that's the humble beginning that we want to do as trained professionals, but not having a component of assistive and adaptive technologies, and we want to start learning and upgrading ourselves to a point of really being functional in that area. Thank you.
I'm not an expert in adaptive technologies, but I've just spoken with a few people to get more kind of a perspective on adaptive technologies and assisted learning and equity issues in India. What we are seeing is, this was really interesting for me too when I started looking at some of the data, that about more than 25% of adolescents drop out and they don't reach high school, and about more than 50% of these adolescents are actually adolescents with special needs. So there's a large chunk of dropout adolescents who do have special needs. So that's quite a big kind of an insight for me. Now, what it really also means is, because India had Right to Education Act, which means from 1st to 8th grade, education will be free and compulsory for everyone. The enrollment rates of children with disabilities in the primary elementary grades was still high. But when it comes to 9th and 10th grade, this is like a very sharp drop in enrollment of adolescents with special needs. So they kind of disappear, they don't continue school after elementary education. And it's not a very complex scenario to understand, because in rural areas, and most of the, about 70% of children with special needs they live in rural areas. And there the high school is separate from the elementary school. So it's also the physical mobility. You go get comfortable with the elementary school, and when the compulsory education is over, not many do transit and go to the high school. And high schools are not always accessible in your villages. So then it becomes very difficult for children with special needs to basically go to a nearby semi-urban area to attend those high schools. So those are like simple reasons, but very huge ones when you see how only 2% of the children with special needs reach high school. I was talking to a few colleagues, and the rural and the urban basically phenomena is very complex and very interesting to analyze also when it comes to children with special needs. It seems like it's very inclusive education for children with special needs when it's in the rural area, because you have no other school, a special school to go. So then you are forced to just go to the same elementary school where others are going, but then you don't get any assistance to stay and complete your elementary education, because there is no special need teacher in rural areas. So it's more inclusive in the rural areas, but when in the urban areas, I think it's more exclusive, because you have specialized schools for special needs children. So then in urban areas, children with special needs do access the special schools. So that's, again, it's more inclusive in rural areas by force, but it's more exclusive in urban areas where there are resources. So that's, I thought it was quite interesting. Now, when it comes to policy, I agree with Don Passey that it's just very vague and it's very overall. There are no specifics. And that makes it very difficult and superficial to basically percolate any resources on ground. So for example, the right to education does speak about every school should have access to a special need teacher, but it's just not happening on ground, because even getting a regular teacher is very difficult in some of the rural areas. Now, one thing which was again very interesting was, at least urban or rural schools, you will see, even if it's a very small school, there is a ramp, you know, for the wheelchair, and you will find it everywhere. The remotest you go, you find a ramp. I have visited so many schools, I always see a ramp. Even if it doesn't look like a ramp, it's there because it's part of the act. So I was just talking to one person who specializes in this area, and she said, but the ramps are useless in rural schools because children who have physical disabilities, they don't have the wheelchairs. So mostly they are brought by their relatives, you know, they pick up and they bring the child in the school. So, I mean, sometimes it's like universal design and you have ramps and it's in the act, they have it, but children don't have wheelchairs to even use those ramps. So it's a little, I found it was, you know, the policy needs to be more detailed, more contextual. You cannot have one policy for urban and rural because the contexts are different, and I think it should be different. When it comes to adaptive technologies, I think maybe it's more universal, but when I was talking with this expert, she said the urban and the private schools have a lot of adaptive technologies when it comes to visual impairment. The screen readers and, you know, other technologies which augments the reading experience. And when it comes to auditory impairment, it's more it's more to do with organ. I mean, it's more to do technically with the physical organ and not so much in as a learning aid. And there's a whole buzz in the urban area. I think there's a lot of awareness now about learning disabilities. And it suddenly came because in India, everyone loves Hindi movies, the Bollywood that they call. And there was one movie which came, very superstar basically did emphasize on dyslexia. So I think, I think what schools and, you know, NGOs are not able to do, Bollywood can really do. And there's so much awareness about dyslexia and what is dyslexia and how parents should be aware about it. And it just goes across urban, rural, remote, all the settings, because everyone likes to see movies. So I think this whole media became more powerful than anything else to convey and sensitize a large population about learning disabilities. When it comes to teachers, I've seen there are specialized courses which says this, you can be a specialized, you can be a special teacher. So you kind of add a specialization in your Bachelor in Education degree. But mostly this B.Ed specialization stays in urban areas. Very rarely you will find these teachers in the rural. In fact, there was some survey that we did in Mumbai area, which is like heart of India. And this one of my students was doing this survey just to find how many government schools within a radius of 5 kilometers in one of the areas have counselors, and none of the government schools had a counselor. So special education also, I mean, this is Mumbai, it's not even rural area. So, you know, it's something which is there a little bit in the policy, but it's not very well described and it kind of gets lost. Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay, so can I thank all of the panel members? And I've been asked to now take forward the discussion. So the discussion means that we would like some input from you, and comments, questions, etc. are welcome. And then I will invite particular panel members to maybe respond to those comments or questions, or if you wish to make a comment or a question to any of us on the panel, then please indicate that. But otherwise, I will take a decision as to who might be able to take on board the comment or question. So the floor is entirely open. Please let us know, and there's a microphone. Please use the microphone when you're commenting or responding.
Thank you. I am George from Serbia. First, I would like to thank Anton for organizing these panels. I think these panels are taking care about very important and somehow neglected issues, especially vocational education and this problem with assisting disability people to improve their quality of life. I am also very grateful to Don, who emphasized that we need to take a wider social perspective, taking care that there are about 14 disability groups, maybe even more than 10 disability groups. And now I would like to also mention that Klaus, in the last 10 years or more, organized many successful conferences here in Linz.
Thank you.
Yes, and producing very good books published by Springer. And I was happy to contribute a paper 2 days ago. And this paper deals with quality of life. I think you mentioned quality of life, like quality. So I think the question is how we can use information communication technology to improve the quality of life, taking care about what we can term living capital, whether it's dealing with education, especially with access to libraries in the last couple of years, or e-governmental issues, or let's say socializing, or organizing leisure activities, or maybe shopping, and what is the most important, perhaps health support. So I think the direction of potential research or promising research would be, because we have different groups, disability groups, these groups have different expectation about the support of technology to improving the quality of their lives. So maybe we can focus on making distinction between different groups in terms of their needs, what technology can help them to attain. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Klaus, would you like to start by responding to that one?
Yeah. First, I have to say thank you for advertising. I didn't want to make shameless self-advertising. You did it for me. Thank you.
But it was not agreed before that.
I fully agree with you, and I think this driving the development and enforcing the end users that they can express themselves, that they bring to the table what research should do, how education should be organized. I think that's really the most important starting point. I want to answer to yours and perhaps also to a general fear which might come along. You talked about 40 kinds of disabilities. The WHO categorization, ICF, speaks about 1,400 categories of different requirements of people. So there is a complexity. But I think there is one important issue, that much more of competence technology is out there than we think. We have to rethink the structures which we have. And let's take the example of schools. We do have, since decades or even centuries, very specialized expertise in supporting the different groups of people with disabilities. But the organizational structure in the UK different, in particular to Nordic countries, but they tended to be separated, and they were not really responsive to new technological developments. And I did, in my country here in Austria, an analysis over the last 20 years of the curricula of special education teachers. It is not mentioned the word assistive technology. It's not mentioned the word accessibility. So this is broadly ignored. And I think this is one of the most tremendous needs in our country, and I can estimate also in other countries, that we rethink the education of these specialists, because they should then take care that the basic technology is there. This is not, in my opinion, the task of every teacher out there. How should he ever get the knowledge about all these groups? We have medical doctors who specialize in a very specific subject. And the teacher, it seems to be, we expect he should be responsible for everything. He can't do that. That's not feasible. But we have the specialists, and we have to rethink. And there are good models, for example, in the Nordic country. They closed. I worked in the 90s with a group in Stockholm, a special school for blind. It was closed in the year 1999. It doesn't exist any longer. The expertise goes out, and these are community-based support centers. It's rethinking the organization. It's not overloading the teacher out there that he should do everything. He gets the support he needs. And this is what I want to convey as a message. We have to rethink the organizational structures. Technology in all domains forces us to rethink our organizational structures. Banking, shopping, everything is changing. And in the same way, we have to rethink inclusion of people with disabilities in these structures. There is the competence, but we have to bring the competence to the right place. And Austria is a very good model to see that no decisions are made. We still have the special education. The policy is always saying we do inclusion, and in between, nothing is happening. And this has to be overcome. We have to use all the resources, which are always restricted, but we have to use them in the right way. So we have a basic layer where we have experts for the different groups, providing the technology, educating the people, and also supporting the teachers. And of course, there is a layer where we need education for mainstream teachers, that they understand accessibility requirements. But we made a course, we do courses here in Austria. This is all the technologies, all the software which is in there to make content accessible. There are standards. This is not rocket science. Everybody can do it. But it has to be part of the curricula as well, that this is understood. And then, of course, there is a much more complex level of didactical approaches, new approaches to inclusive processes, to make really inclusion and experience that people, not only people with disabilities benefit, that every student benefits of understanding the quality of being open to anybody in society, because this is a benefit for everyone. And these are, in my opinion, the different layers where we have to allocate the responsibility to the right people and to the right organizational levels.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. So I'm going to invite comment or on Klaus's response there. Klaus has indicated the need to think about this in terms of organization, particularly when change is happening. So I'm going to invite comment on this. I think Sue.
Thank you. I find myself in the situation where I've got so much to say that it's going to be difficult to make it coherent. But I agree with you, Klaus, up to an extent. But I've been doing research in UK schools, looking at it from a very ground-up perspective. And I think I disagree a little bit about where this should be situated in schools, because I think compared with some countries, we're in a privileged position in the global north, that we have experts in schools who, like teaching assistants and qualified teachers of sensory impairment, but what I'm not seeing is teachers working with them very closely. So I agree that we can't expect teachers to have everything, but there's a huge difference between a teacher working with a teaching assistant before they enter the classroom and a teaching assistant working with somebody in a classroom. And particularly with one-to-one programs, and technology affords such huge possibilities for every child to be in that class to be doing the same. Nobody's stigmatized because the teachers work with the teaching assistant before they've gone in, worked out what the child can do, can't do, and then works with the whole class at the same time. And that is, to me, is inclusion. Whereas a teaching assistant sitting with a child, having to do different things, with them sitting slightly apart, that's integration. And I think that's really important. And even the Indian model, if teachers were taught to be inclusive, properly inclusive from the beginning, in the same way that we want teachers to be better able to use technology, if all that was brought together, because if you look at teacher education, a lot of it has social markers such as gender, race, ethnicity, all these things. Disability is often left off that list. And yet we're at this fulcrum in time where technology, because the accessibility which is built into technology could really move things forward. And as far as I can see, it's not happening most of the time. And teachers are very well-meaning, but they're not being supported to recognise what's in front of them. Okay, I'll get off my hobby horse.
Okay, thank you, Sue. Before I ask anyone from the panel to respond, Christina, I think that your hand was up next. I'm going to ask you to maybe you also want to comment on the same thing, but I'd also like to go back to the organisational issue and problem a little later. But Christina, let's...
So I'm Christine, I'm from Germany, and I'm at the University of Education, where we have one faculty or one department specializing in special needs teachers for special education. And it's really very strange that they don't like IT in education, or they don't like technologies or at all. So there's hardly any contact between the departments working general teacher education and using IT and the special need education. Also, I think in Germany, the inclusion means a lot that you just make it possible for a student with whatever needs to go to the school wherever he or she wants to go. So the parents, of course, they know about the special items or special things of the disability, maybe, or the group, but the teachers don't know it. So, and for teachers, it's very difficult to find out, for example, that there are technologies helping this special needs. So I think there must be much more contact, or maybe it must be much easier to get these two specialists together. But in the German ordinance system, in my home states, there is nothing to do this right now, because it's very accidentally that some teacher knows about this specific technology and uses it or not.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Sindri, you had your hand up as well. Would you like to add a comment on this sort of area too?
Yeah, my name is Sindri. I'm from Norway, so it's similar as from Sweden. We closed down. The law for special education was integrated into general school laws 40 years ago, I think, and the special schools was closed down during the 80s and 90s. But of course there are pros and cons, because if there is one deaf child in the school, they feel very special. I mean, sometimes in a negative way. So then we try to let them have mates in other schools, but it's not easy. But it's possible. The idea behind it is that every child has the right to belong to his own community and go to his own community school. And I think that's good. And it functions well. And I want also to mention that we have now starting using iPads, one iPad per child. And that was a key eye-opener for a lot of teachers, because the children with dyslexia said, well, now I'm a normal student. Nobody knows about my reading problems, because I can overcome them during the use of iPad, because I can put on the sound. I have what do you call it? Headphones. Yes, headphones. So I can listen to the text. But I'm sometimes worried that not all teachers make use of the technology, even if it's bought for the school. So we have general teachers. He's taking care of most of the education, and we have specialists, sometimes just coming to instruct teachers, some specialists in the school, depending on the size of the school. But do you know anything about how much special programs for voice activation and things like that are used? I mean, I'm very worried that we do have the equipment, and some teachers are using it, but not all. And then there is still it's blurred what is happening. Do you know have it been done research on this in countries that have the equipment and have the software, how it is used?
Okay, thank you, Sindre. Before we pick up on that last question, I'd like to pick up on something else that was coming up through yours and Christina and Sue's comments, which is also picking up on what you were saying, Amina, about what you're seeing as difference between rural and urban inclusion, and it comes back, I think, to what you were saying, Sindre, about the right of the child to go to the school of the community, to a community school. I mean, the question here that I would ask is, to what extent is community a concept and a strength of concept within rural compared to urban locations? And I mean, maybe from the Indian perspective, you could pick up a bit on that, Amina, and give us an idea of where that might lie in terms of how you see individuals working with communities and what that might mean in terms of rural and urban localities. Yeah.
With rural and urban, I think rural societies are more organized when it comes to community support. I don't specifically know how it goes with special needs, but with ITE, this integration of technology, I've seen in very, very remote areas, which are basically even conflict zones where no teachers will go, and we tried to put IT there, and we were very scared that the computers will get robbed from the schools. And there came community support, because tribal communities, are very organized, and they are very, there's a lot of unity in it. And they said, we will sleep outside the schools in the night, and we'll make sure that computers are not stolen by the other conflict groups. So I think in rural areas, the community support is very, very strong, which can be mobilized also in the case of resources for special needs. But it's kind of complex. Not every rural society will have that characteristic. If it's tribal, if it's like one kinship, then it's different than any other rural area. But in urban, it's more fragmented. It only stays with, I think, family, or if there is a little bit more organized depending on the state. For example, one of our northeastern state, which is Mizoram, where there is a majority of Christian population, even there is a lot of sense of community, even though it's urban. And the church comes into existence and gives that structure to the community. And then the resources start pouring in. But I've seen a lot of NGO-run resources in rural areas which support special needs, but not so much coming from the government side.
Okay, thank you, Amina. I mean, I think what from a policy point of view, from a policy perspective, it does seem to me from the discussion coming out here that there is that this factor of community involvement, community responsibility is something that should really be considered to a greater extent, perhaps, than it is. At least it needs to be in there and thought about and considered. The other point, before we go on to this sort of extensive use of adaptive and assistive technologies, it comes back to what you were saying, Klaus, about organisation, and also what you were saying, Paul, about the place that you're in now, i.e. the position that you're in, looking at moving forward in terms of working with and implementing. And for me, one of the things here is, if one's bringing about elements of change and elements of major change, then if there are organisational changes that are happening with that, it's very important to get an horizon perspective that one actually needs to think about the lengths of time that one would potentially think something might take in order to put something in place, and how one would problematize what one is doing in order to strategize it. In other words, what are you attempting to do? How long will it take you to get to certain stages? And therefore, how do you put a plan into place of where you ultimately want to be? So this idea is that change isn't something that happens instantly. Instant change is something that can happen to us, and sometimes we think it's very good and sometimes we think it's very bad. But instantaneous change when you come to education and learning is something that actually is something we've had to handle. It's not something that we can expect. We do have to think about this organisation and change process. So I think what I ask really is, to what extent does policy help us with that? To what extent does policy help us to think of the long-term strategy and the timelines and the plans that will be put in place to enable us to get to the position that we want to go? So, Paul, you're at a starting position from what you've described in Botswana with regard to this. Is this something, is this sort of planning and thinking about the long term, is that something that you're also concerned with when you're looking at this in Botswana? Maybe you could tell us a bit about that, could you?
Yeah, well, it's such a difficult question because, you know, there is always power involved. For as long as the Ministry of Education, which has the mandate to really come up with change strategies, well, I don't dispute that we could also prompt the change, but for as long as the powers that be really are not really receptive to the change process. So what we are trying to do is to see how we could you know, entice certain groups and communities to have buy-in, but we are still at an initial stages of plotting out the strategy. But what we find out really is that basically policy is it's blunt, but it's articulate on what should happen. But then it is the processes within the regions. Like your earlier question, well, in Botswana, there is a rural development policy. For example, they have started now to come up with community junior secondary schools so that each community is provided with a junior secondary school so that at least they should consider themselves a community, and there are parent-teacher associations associated with each school. But the rural and urban contrast is also a problem because you find that within the rural areas, it's only the teachers there and a few members of the community who are, you know, educated, who can also support. That's when maybe NGOs also are showing interest in this humble cause. So maybe tapping from the NGOs and coming up with a change strategy consisting of those who have the money, the power, and also such collaborations. Like now, I'm just thinking of, I was really impressed by the presentation by a colleague from Austria. It looks that they are far much ahead and they're thinking. So that's another thing to consider, that maybe we could also coerce the government into sending some people here to come and learn, because they always do that. But maybe they send them to the wrong places, maybe without really thinking about it. Because I think, you know, those kinds of things can also help. You know, a multi-pronged approach, looking at maybe training, looking at maybe setting up, you know, platforms, and then trying to prompt the change. And like what Don is saying, I think there will always be an opportunity for changing the situation for as long as people are committed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So now I'd like to come back to the last point, because I think that if one's thinking about planning and strategy, one also needs detail. One needs to know the situation and to monitor that situation with regard to how things are moving forward. And I think that's where research is particularly important in order to gain evidence of that monitoring, review and the process of implementation and change. So extents of use currently are certainly very, very important, I think. One needs to know what the situation is. And going back to that paper by Bergstaller, you know, she was saying that basically within US universities, the situation is not good. You know, she provides evidence that actually the use of assistive technologies, the use of technology to support online access are not being integrated and developed. But maybe, Klaus, would you have any view on the extent of uses of these applications, of these assistive technologies, and where we are in terms of our research need with that? I'm an engineer, and therefore I don't have really data which I could present, but there is evidence that these features, these assistive features, for example on iPad, that in particular the groups with learning difficulties, but also those with vision problems and so on, are more and more extensively using it. So I'm not sure about, but I think 1.5, 2 years ago I read about that in particular on iPad, the text-to-speech reading, and also with other approaches like Kindle and so on, this EPUB 3-based documents, that they are used at least by 20 to 25%. So it's no longer stigmatizing moving from visual reading to audio reading. This is simply a fact. That's what we do. The technology is there. And also features, for example, like a screen reader. Each of these devices, this was special technology some years ago, but a screen reader is part of the operating system now. And people are using it and get to use it. What is still a big problem is getting users who could benefit from it, that they get to know about it and that they get trained. And also the train-the-trainer issue. And as said before, there is evidence in our country this is not part of the curriculum. Only if you have a very special interest learning it, then this might be an elective course. But it's not part of the core curriculum, in particular not of those who are specialists in the field later. And that's, in my opinion, is a big problem and should be changed rapidly. Okay, thank you, Klaus. So I'm going to ask that question of you as the participants. So where do we think we are with regard to our research knowledge on this? Do we have an extensive research knowledge of extensive use of assistive technologies, of where they are of benefit, where individuals are may be able to use them, where they are being used in online environments, within media, by producers, etc. Where do we think the evidence is? Because clearly this is important in terms of understanding where we're starting from and where we're going to with this. So I open this as a question for any comment. I'd be interested to hear your views on where you think the evidence base is on this in terms of our understanding. Raymond?
If you look at the trend, actually, in a very general way, you are very lucky if you are able to solve the problem at the country level. And there are many, many examples of no solution or not progress when you take the global country or a group of countries. if you need some example, take all the NGOs and UN agency and so on, and you have plenty of example of non-progressive work. What I observe on the international level, it's you have to go to the granularity of the city and the region. And that is the only possibility to solve the problem. Because you take special conditions, special framework inside the country, and you have many places different in the same country. And I think it's a good advice to say, don't take the globality, but take example or work at the local, with a global view and vision for the country. Of course, it's not to create the chaos, but I think you should take the granularity of the city, of the region.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. I don't know whether anyone else would like, Sue?
Excuse me. From the searching I've been doing recently, I mean, there's a huge amount of knowledge based in practitioners, people working with disabled children, and there's more about adults, but there's so little research about how disabled children use technology to support them. It's a complete gap at the moment, and I've been looking into this because I'm writing a book about this. Thought I'd plug that. And one of the reasons is that there's actually not that much research about how children, disabled children in schools, are supported anyway. So, you know, bringing in technology is like jumping over 2 hurdles because there's not that much research in the first place. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So I think, unless anyone else would like to comment, it sounds as though actually our research base in this, yes, Gerard?
I think that accessibility is very important also for regular information systems that are not assistive technologies, but they become assistive technologies if you use accessibility. But usually not for all the groups you presented, these 40 groups of exclusion. For example, we produced an online course last year for learning programming, and we used a lot of videos, and this supports dyslexia people, and maybe also some geographic excluded people, but we do not support blind people and other physical excluded people and also many others. So it is not so easy to apply this accessibility for all these groups.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So I guess that one of the things that comes out of this is actually how we're going to move forward from a policy perspective. I mean, that's what we're thinking about here. That it sounds as though actually the amount of research evidence that we have on this is not that extensive. It's not that great. And from a policy point of view, therefore, to think about moving forward, do we need more? And if that is the case, how do we do that? And at the same time, picking up on what Sue was saying about there are practices that are happening there, but actually those might be limited and they're happening in pockets. So how do we move forward with that? How do we move forward with a research base that also gives us the opportunity to share practices where that can be of benefit? So I don't know whether any of the panel would like to comment on that, or any of you as participants would like to comment on that. How do we move forward from this position? And we've got probably time for a fairly short amount of response, but that I think is a key question. Where we are with policy seems to be limited to some extent by our limitation with regard to research evidence. How do we move forward with that so that it can be of benefit to policy and of benefit to practice? Any thoughts from the panel, Klaus?
Yeah, I think one, as Gerald outlined, one thing is that because there is a globally working activity on accessibility, for example, videos, making videos accessible for blind people with descriptive information and so on. This can be done. And there is also research going on in artificial intelligence to automatically support this and so on. So there is good progress. But what you mentioned, I think, is of key importance to go on. We have these accessibility standards for all digital media, including e-learning, and they need to be respected. It can't be, and I think I know from Cheryl Burgstaller, this is changing dramatically in the US due to legal enforcement, which is in place, which is different, what is very much different in European countries, more in the UK, but in Austria, as said before, this is broadly ignored. Really ignored. And this has to be, so to say, one of the basic layers. And the second one, I think, is also policy actions to say, if we accept this as an important issue, then it also has to be part of the curricula. We can't send teachers into school not having heard about it. We can't educate specialists in special education, inclusive education, not knowing about assistive technology and accessibility. I think this is a second aspect which could really make very fast a difference, not immediately. It takes time, but it really leads to a change.
Okay, thank you, Klaus. Now, I'm aware of the fact that at midday we need to be in the closing session, and my guess is that you might like a short comfort break before being in the closing session. So I'm going to say I think that this is clearly an important area of discussion. I hope that we've opened this up in some way, and that there will be ways of taking this forward in the future through the policy directions that you are thinking of, Anton. So I want to say thank you all for coming and participating and for giving your views. And I particularly want to say thank you to my colleagues on the panel, and can I ask you to thank everyone?
Thank you.